All right, so thanks for joining us. This is the second summer digital series episode, and today we'll be going over some training principles. So we're going to talk about specificity and progressive overload. Okay, so if you weren't here last week, the goal of this series basically is for Queen Strength Conditioning. We're trying to break down and discuss different training principles, ideas, and methods for you to be able to add these to your own workouts and just kind of see the why behind what we do as far as training goes. So methods and principles. So as to the methods, there may be a million and then some, but principles are few. The man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods. The man who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble. This is a quote by Harrington Emerson. He was an engineer and business theorist back in the day. And what I'm trying to get at here is if you go online and you look at any sort of training programs there, whether it be in the gym or bodyweight programs, or if you have someone else write you a program, there's tons of different methods that these people are using. But the one underlying factor here is they're all following training principles. So if you understand these principles when you create your own programs, it doesn't matter what method you use, they'll be successful and you'll see progress. Okay, so today, obviously there are many different training principles, but we'll be talking about specificity and progressive overload. Okay, so specificity, we can break this down into the SAID principle. So specific adaptations to impose demands. Okay, so your body will specifically adapt to the demands placed on it. So for instance, how do we take athletes and train them in the weight room or on the turf? And then how can they successfully perform on the court or field or ice, wherever they're performing? So just a note, training can start out general, okay, but over time it must become more specific for your goals or your sport. Okay, so for instance, if you want to train for weight loss, obviously your training must be specific towards that goal. If you wanted to run a marathon or a 5K or 10K, your training must be specific towards that goal. So we can break this down, contrast it between cross country and rugby. So we have two very different sports here. So rugby obviously being a speed power sport and cross country being a fully aerobic sport. So different demands are placed on the body. Okay, obviously in cross country, there's no contact, or there shouldn't be anyways. And in rugby, we obviously have contact between the two different teams. Okay, so training must reflect that for these athletes to be successful. Okay, so for instance, rugby, we're training more force and strength output. And then in cross country, we're looking at more stability of the hip and the core. Okay, so obviously there are many similarities between the training, but as we get closer to their competitions, training must transition to be more specific for them to be successful. Okay, so using a weight room example, for instance, for cross country, if we wanted to go general to specific, we might start with a front plank to improve stability of the core and the trunk. From there, we can transition to a bird dog, and then from there, a bird dog single arm row. And from there, we might go to something like a single leg RDL. Okay, so we're making it more unstable. Moving to that single leg position, or on the bench, we can see here one hand and one leg, and we're adding movement throughout the limbs, which is what they're doing when they're running, right? So we're trying to stabilize the trunk while creating motion and run. So moving on to rugby, okay, obviously we want a little more strength and force output when they're playing. So we might go for a goblet squat, work on technique, develop a little bit of strength there, and then obviously to overload it, we'll move to a back squat. We can add more weight. And then we'll transition to a sled push. And obviously we can see in this image here, a sled push looks more similar to what forwards in rugby would be doing in the scrum than in the back squat. So we're going from those general movement patterns to more sport-specific movement patterns. Okay, this is the same for conditioning, or what we call energy systems development. So in terms of time, conditioning will get closer to the demands of the sport. So in rugby, it's an 80-minute match, about 35 minutes of actual playing time, and that's broken down into short, powerful bursts followed by rest periods. So obviously the conditioning will kind of reflect that. And then in cross country, it's just a straight continuous output. So they're running 10K, and their training would have to reflect that. So for us, we don't do any energy systems development with cross country. That's done with their coach. But our training is looking to support that. So that's basically the principle specificity, or the SAID principle, so specific adaptations to impose demands. And you would use that principle to kind of tailor your training to be more specific so that you're more successful in what you're trying to achieve with your workouts or your training sessions. So moving on from here, we get into progressive overload. Okay, so this is really important when we're training. So basically progressive overload is doing more over time to get more returns. So we got to do more to get more. Okay, so just a little story that I always add on whenever I talk about progressive overload. So you might wonder why I have this guy carrying a bowl around. So there's a myth of a guy named Milo of Croton. He's an ancient Greece wrestler. And for his training, he would carry this little calf up a hill every single day. And each day, the calf would get a little heavier and heavier and get bigger and bigger until it was a full-grown bull, as you can see in that picture. And that was his training. His training every day was to carry this bull up the hill. And each day it would progressively get heavier and kind of get progressive overload through that. Now, obviously, we don't have a lot of hills around here. We also don't have a lot of calves readily available for us to carry up the hills. So I'm going to talk about how we can use progressive overload in our workouts and our training to get more gains. So 5 ways we can progressively overload our workouts. So we can talk about time under tension, range of motion, volume, intensity, and density. So I'll explain what these are and how we can use them in our workouts to program. So before I get into that, let's talk about increase of efficiency. Okay, so obviously before we can progress exercises, we need to make sure we're proficient in those exercises. So this is obviously critical for beginners. So we're lifting the same load and volume with better technique each time, okay? And that load might just be body weight. In the picture, the person's using a dumbbell for their split squat, but it might just be body weight. But basically our goal is to learn how to do the exercise with perfect technique before we then go and add load or add more time or duration or whatnot. So we want to make sure that we understand how to do the exercise properly before we increase the demands on the body. Okay, so our first progressive overload principle here is so increase time under tension. Okay, so this is referring to tempos or pauses. So we're increasing the duration of the eccentric and isometric portions of the contraction. Okay, so eccentric being the lowering, if we're talking about this rear foot elevated split squat here, or the lengthening of the muscles during contraction. And the isometric portion would be the pause at the bottom. And that would be contraction where there's no movement occurring with the muscle. So you're in a static position. So for example, a lot of people at home right now don't have any equipment. So if you wanted to progressively overload a bodyweight squat, you could add a 3-second lower and a 2-second pause to the exercise. Alternatively, if you were in a gym, as you can see here, this person's doing a rear foot elevated split squat with a dumbbell in a goblet position. They could add a 3-second lower and a 2-second pause, or a 5-second lower with a 1-second pause. Whatever time you wanted to use there is appropriate as long as you're progressing it. So for instance, I wouldn't go from no pauses to then a 10-second pause. I might go no pause to a 1-second pause to a 2-second pause to a 3-second pause, something like that. So we're increasing time under tension, adds mechanical stress to the movements. Another important factor is that it helps us with our technique. So as we increase load, we tend to try and speed up the process of the movement. So if I'm going really fast in my back squat, it might be easy for me to get out of position. So if I slow it down, it allows me to kind of self-correct as I'm going through the movement. Okay, so the second one here, we're going to increase range of motion. Okay, so we're lifting the same load for increased distance. Okay, so we can see in the picture here, the individual has their front foot elevated on the step. Okay, this allows them to get more range of motion in their split squat. So it gives you more room for that back leg to go down and increased demand on the hips. Okay, so at home, this is easily done by increasing box height for something like a lunge or a step up. A lot of people have steps in their house, so you can go from 1 step to 2 steps. Okay, so we're increasing the range of motion. Or if you're in the gym, there's something called like deficit deadlifts. You might have seen that where they stand on a small step or a small box, usually 2 to 3 inches, and they do deadlifts from there. So it's increasing the range of motion to get down to the bar and then pick up the bar. Alternatively, there are some times where reducing the range of motion can add overload. So for instance, if you're doing a board press for bench press, you would add a 1, 2, or 3 inch board on your chest. That reduces the range of motion, but it allows you to add more weight. So 2 different ways you can kind of adjust range of motion there to add overload. So, and then the next one here, we have increase in volume. Okay, so this might be the easiest for individuals at home, since a lot of people don't have a full set of dumbbells or barbells at home. So if you only have 1 dumbbell or 1 kettlebell, easy way to progress here is to add volume. So we're going to use the same load, which is weight, and we're doing more reps. Or alternatively, you can use the same number of reps and load while doing more sets. Okay, so if we break down our training program, say we had a 4-week training program, week 1, in our first example, we might do 5 sets of 4 repetitions. So that's 20 total reps. And for this example, we'll be using a 20-pound dumbbell and a goblet squat. Then we move on to week 2. So we'll be doing 5 sets of 5 reps each. And so we're adding 5 total reps to that workout. Okay, so we've added overload. We've used the same dumbbell, the 20-pound dumbbell, but we've added more reps, so we're doing more work. In the second example, week 1, we're going to do 4 sets of 4 reps, so it's 16 total reps. We can still be using that same 20-pound dumbbell. And in week 2, we go 5 sets of 4 reps. So we've added a set, kept the reps the same, but as you can see, it increases our workload to 20 total repetitions. So obviously, like I said before, if you don't have a lot of equipment, this is an easy way to add progressive overload to your workouts. Even if you don't have any dumbbells, you can just use body weight. Nice, easy way to add more reps each time you do the workout. So moving on from there, we have increased intensity. Okay, so obviously, if you're in a gym, this is pretty easy to do because you're just lifting more weight each time you're in the gym. So the reps will stay the same, or generally they'll decrease. Okay, so we can't have volume increase, so the amount of work we do, with intensity increasing as well. Intensity and volume have an inverse relationship. So as volume increases, intensity will decrease, and as intensity increases, volume will decrease. Okay, so for example here, if we still have our 4-week training block, in week 1, we might do 3 sets of 10. For instance, if we're using a back squat, we might do 50% of our 1 rep max. Okay, so if my 1 rep max squat was 200 pounds, I would do 3 sets of 10 at 100 pounds. Okay, the next week, I would add a little bit of weight, okay, with the reps coming down. So for week 2, I would do 3 sets of 8 reps, so we can see the volumes coming down, and I would use 55% of my 1 rep max. So the weight would increase a little bit. So we see volume decreases, intensity increases here. So a little more difficult to do at home if you're limited with equipment, but what you can do is if you have a backpack and a bunch of textbooks, I know I have a ton of textbooks lying around, so you can fill that backpack up with some textbooks and you can do the same thing. So each week or each training session, you can just add a little bit more weight to that bag and you can get an increase in intensity. And our final variable here, we can increase density of the training. So we're going to do the same amount of sets in less time, or we'll do more sets in the same amount of time. So in the first example, okay, so week 1, we might do 3 sets of 5 reps. Say, for instance, we're doing a deadlift here. 3 sets of 5 reps with a 2-minute rest in between each set. Week 2, we come back to the gym. We're going to do 3 sets of 5 reps with a 1.5-minute rest. So we've reduced the rest time. So we've done the same amount of work as far as sets and reps go in a reduced amount of time. Okay, so we've made it harder. And alternatively, another variation we can use is like if you had a circuit. So say you were doing a bodyweight squat, a push-up, a rocking plank, and a lunge, a reverse lunge. Okay, so week 1, you could do a 10-minute time limit of those exercises, and you could say, okay, I'm going to do 10 reps of each, and you can see how many times you get through that circuit in 10 minutes. Okay, so say for instance in week 1, I complete 5 sets of that circuit or 5 rounds. In week 2, I would keep my 10-minute time limit the same. Okay, and my goal would be with maintaining good technique is increasing the amount of times I can get through that circuit. Okay, so 10-minute time limit stays the same, but I've increased the amount of time I've done in that 10 minutes. Okay, so those are our 5 progressive overload principles we can apply to our workouts. Okay, so in summary, utilizing progressive overload and increasing specificity over time will lead to increased performance and success in relation to our training goals. So remember, whatever your goals are, your training needs to be specific to those goals. Okay, so if I wanted to become a faster sprinter, I wouldn't go for 10K jogs every day. I would probably work on sprinting, okay, and vice versa. Okay, and as always, join us next week, same time, Wednesday at 1 p.m. We'll be discussing acceleration mechanics and how to add sprinting to your workouts at home and in the gym. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to toss them down in the chat. Okay. Perfect. I guess there's no questions. Hope everyone has a good day. Oh, we got one question from Josh. So how do you know how much to progress each week in each workout? So Josh, it depends on the exercise, obviously, okay? And it depends on what equipment you have available. Okay, so for instance, if I'm in a gym and I have access to dumbbells or barbells, it's a little easier to make progressions in weight. But if I don't have that equipment, then you got to be a little more creative with like tempos and eccentrics and stuff like that. So for me, the biggest thing is I always like to err on the side of caution. So it's really easy to progress slowly each week, okay? But once you progress too much, it's hard to kind of pull back. So say, for instance, if I added 50 pounds to my back squat in 1 week, it would be hard to do, and it would probably be too much for me. So for me, if I'm using barbell work, I like to make jumps of like 2.5%, depending on the individual. Okay, obviously that percentage is a little bit different depending on the 1 rep max. Okay, and then for dumbbell exercises, most gyms have 5-pound increments of dumbbells. So for increasing intensity, I just like to say, hey, try and go up 5 pounds. If you can't, stay at the weight you did before, and then try and progress from there. Does that kind of answer your question, Josh? Perfect. All right. So I hope everyone stays safe. Have a great day, and I will see you guys next week.